I would like to pay my respect to elders, past and present, and the future elders, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So it's been a very exciting and busy time for Pracy since the conference in May. Many of you might know that we were successful as part of a consortium in winning the tender to review best practice in early childhood intervention in Australia. So we look forward to engaging with many of you as part of that project. We have also opened our membership portal and look forward to engaging more with members as well in the near future. So you can head to our website or subscribe to our newsletter to keep up to date on everything that we're doing, including more upcoming webinars. But we are here today to hear from Dr. Robin McWilliam. So many of us on the call have, had many opportunities to work with Robin in a variety of ways and have known Robin for many years. For myself, it was many years ago that I first met Robin and also had the pleasure of taking part in one of his trainings that was done in Chattanooga. And we also incorporated the routines-based early intervention model into the team around the child model of disability services in WA. And I know as well that there's many colleagues from that team who are on the call as well. So I think we've got many converts of Robin's work in Australia. So before we start, Robin has kindly agreed to allow the presentation to be recorded. If you can keep your videos off during the presentation and your mics, but there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you ask a question at the end, you can come off a video to do that if you would like, or you can put your questions in the chat. As much as possible, please keep your questions in the chat as well to the end, unless there's something that you really need clarification on. And we have got Kerry, Megan and Chris who are monitoring the chat for us today, and they will let Robin know if there is something that needs clarification. We also do have a poll at the end of the presentation, so I would ask you to please stay on the line just for a few minutes. It's very short to complete that for us. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robin McWilliam. Robin, if you can come on screen, that would be great. So Robin is a professor at the University of Alabama, where he founded and directs the evidence-based International Early Intervention Office, more commonly known as EIEIO. He's written several books and almost 100 peer-reviewed articles, presented, as we know, and provided lots of professional development, including here in Australia. And Robin is also a member of the International Expert Advisory Group for the review of best practice in the Early Childhood Intervention project taking place here at the moment. So today, Robin is stimulating our thinking with a presentation titled How to Make Early Childhood Intervention Relevant for a Change. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Denise, for that generous introduction. I am very happy to be in Australia, even though I'm sitting in Alabama in the United States. Australia is where I plan to go if the authorities catch up with me, so I can be a refugee in Australia because I have so many friends there. So I really value my relationships with Denise, of course, with Kerry Bull, who's on this call, John Foster, Stephen Carberry, also at Noah's Ark, Tim Moore, and other Australian greats. So today I have been following the changes in Australia over the last 15 years or so, and decided that today's talk could be about the issue of relevance in how we provide services to children and their families. So what early childhood intervention is not? it is not a rehabilitation program. So traditional early childhood intervention practices borrow from rehab approaches. And so they sometimes look like weekly sessions, direct hands-on with the child. And the question then becomes, where's the caregiver? That it would be the parent or the teacher if we're talking about a child in a classroom program or childcare. And also, rehab approaches generally work on decontextualized skills. By that, I mean skills that where the context, the routine, the time of day, and so on are not really relevant. It's just based on the skill. Now, that's a pretty damning definition of ECI practices, but I think you'll realize that this definition is not that unusual. So who will use a routines-based approach, which is what I'm labeling as the alternative? You can have some other labels for the alternative, but that's the one that I generally use. So the people who will use this are any kind of ECI provider, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, early childhood special educators, psychologists, and so on. The work that I do is international, and so in different countries, different disciplines are highly involved. I know that I know the ones that are involved in Australia. In other places, psychologists basically run the show, for example. In Taiwan, one of the countries where I work, the physiotherapists are very much in charge of what goes on. But I'm going to be talking about any providers for young children with disabilities and their families. And I'm going to start with a simple concept about learning opportunities. Here are 7 circles drawn with my very highly sophisticated graphics program, as you can see. And I want you to think for a minute about what these 7 circles might represent. What comes in 7s? Right, some of you have got this. It's days of the week. And let me get my pointer going here. What is this little sliver here? That sliver is the early childhood intervention session. And look at all the other white space that happens during the week. And even if you take out the time that the child is asleep, which for very young children might be as much as 10 hours, a little less for slightly older children, there is still a lot of white space. And the white space has become a very popular concept in the Far Eastern countries where I work, Singapore and Taiwan, for example, because that's where children have the opportunity to learn. This tiny little sliver is nothing. And as we're going to talk about in a minute, we'll see that children aren't going to be learning in this tiny little sliver. They're learning throughout the white space of their everyday lives. So how do children learn? They learn through repeated interactions with the environment, dispersed over time, not in massed trials. Massed trials mean where you have repeated attempts, repeated trials. Do this again, do this again, do this again. That's not how kids learn. They learn to say bye-bye by every time something goes away and the caregiver says bye-bye. Or they learn how to put 2 or 3 words together in the context of conversations with adults or older peers. So the point of this slide is about the interactions with the environment dispersed over time. Let's look at this another way. We have this actually slide came from looking at the Australian quality areas. We have visits with the family, or it could be visits with a teacher that happen from time to time. Let's say it might be a week between visits. During those visits, we have family-child interactions and other learning opportunities, or teacher-child interactions and other learning opportunities. And that's where the child learning occurs, not during the actual visits. So then the question becomes, well, then what should we do during our visits with caregivers? And I define caregivers as family members or teachers. And I'll come to the answer about what we should do with them or what the purpose is of those visits in just a minute. I like this quotation from Alexander Den Heijer. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So that means that when a child has problems with functioning, we don't have to just try to teach the child or condition the child to be able to do something differently. We should attend to the context, to the routines, to try to give the child the best opportunities for meaningful participation in that routine. The idea of always trying to fix the child is a deficit approach. So the clinic-based model with hands-on direct therapy or education of the child is actually a deficit approach. It's where we are thinking there's something wrong with the child, so we need to fix the kid, rather than looking at the context in which the child has to function and combining instruction with the child from natural caregivers with adaptations to the activity or environment. Some of you will be familiar with the International Classification of Functioning for Children and Youth from the World Health Organization. And in many countries, that's highly influential on understanding the idea of functioning, so that we're not talking just about skills out of context. We're talking about skills in the context of the activities or routines where the child needs to participate to be successful in life. Let's talk for a minute now about the goodness of fit. Let's take the abilities and interests of the child and the demands of a routine. Now, a routine is a time of day that happens in a child's life. At home, it could be waking up, breakfast time, getting ready to go out, nap time in the afternoon, the dinner preparation time, bath time, and so on. Routines can also be classroom routines, such as arrival time, free play, outside time, snack or lunch, etc. So each routine in a child's day has certain demands. By that I mean the things that a child needs to be able to do to participate meaningfully in that routine. So take breakfast time, for example. At breakfast time, the demands are the ability to come into the place where breakfast is happening, the ability to get into a chair, to sit in a chair, to use utensils or your fingers, the ability to get the food into your mouth, the ability to chew and swallow, the ability to pick up a cup, drink, etc., as well as communication with whoever's providing the breakfast or anybody else at the table, and the participation in the general activities of breakfast time. Those are the demands of that routine. If the child has the abilities to do those things, to come in, climb on the chair, sit in the chair, eat, use utensils or fingers, etc., then the match between those abilities and the demands of the routine are good. So we have good functioning. But if the child is missing some of those abilities or is uninterested in breakfast time or eating or sitting in a chair, then we have diminished functioning. And so intervention is called for. So it's important to think about the goodness of fit between the abilities and interests of the child and the demands of the routine, not just whether the child, not just the abilities and interests of the child, but also what do we need to do about the demands of the routine? Can we adjust those so that the child has a greater opportunity to participate meaningfully in that routine? We have been traditionally in early childhood intervention focused on a deficit approach where we always think that if the kid can't do something, we need to get that kid doing it, instead of thinking about the environment and how that also might need to be adjusted to help the child function. All right, so let's look at contrasts between a traditional way of looking at early childhood intervention and a 21st century way of looking at early childhood intervention. It is not a medical model or an educational model. It is not clinical or self-contained. By that I mean non-inclusive. It is not an expert or directive consultation approach. It is not direct hands-on with children. It is not goals chosen by professionals. And it is not multiple specialists working with the child and family at the same frequency. Now look at this list and see whether the early childhood intervention, as you're familiar with it, actually does do some of these things. And now I'm saying that these are not part of modern evidence-based early childhood intervention. So what is it instead? It's a support-based model providing emotional, material, and informational support to caregivers. It's held in natural environments and the least restrictive environment. We use collaborative consultation instead of expert consultation. We use family or collaborative consultation with caregivers as opposed to working directly with children. The goals are chosen by families, and we use a primary service provider, which in Australia is known as a key worker. So let's look at the implementation of evidence-based practices. There are drivers, implementation drivers, that affect the extent and success of the implementation of evidence-based practices. They include or consist of organizational drivers, such as system-level intervention, leadership drivers from technical leadership, that is, people who can tell you what's allowed and what's not allowed, to adaptive leadership, which is people who tell you, who are encouraging and supportive, and then competency drivers, which goes from deciding who's on the bus, as they say, who are we employing to do early childhood intervention, the training, which in implementation science is considered things like lectures and presentations, and then even more effective coaching. And in implementation science and in early childhood intervention generally, one of the problems is we don't have enough coaching. Systems are not investing enough in coaches who work directly one-on-one with intervention providers. So let's ask some mindset questions. What is functioning? Why should we be family-centered? And I'm also going to address applications to classrooms and to clinics. And what's the purpose of early childhood intervention? So what is functioning? Let's try to define this as functioning is participating meaningfully in naturally occurring routines. So it's not just having the skills, it's having skills that actually allow for meaningful participation in everyday activities that are natural to that family. And an important point that I want to bring in here is that family with their culture, their traditions, and their values. We have three areas that we like to consider when we're looking at meaningful participation. One is engagement. That is a child's ability to participate or to interact with adults, peers, and materials in a developmentally and appropriate and contextually appropriate manner at different levels of competence. So it's about appropriate behavior in that routine. A second is independence. Independence is very highly valued in many cultures, but also remember that we need to be culturally sensitive to the fact that in some cultures, child independence is not highly valued. So in some cultures, a definition of a good mother, for example, is somebody who does things for their child. So independence is one of many reasons why we need to pay attention to the cultural environment in which a child is growing up. And the third dimension is social relationships. Social relationships covers communication and getting along with others, which of course are related. And it puts communication into its proper context, which is social relationships. We don't care what a child can do for a speech therapist in a speech room. That's basically unimportant. We care about what a child can do during the everyday life of that child with the people in that child's environment. Those are the social relationships, and that's why the child needs to have communication skills. The second area is why family-centered. Well, who knows about child functioning? The family does. The family can tell you what a child can and cannot do in different routines of the day. They might not know why a child can't do something. They might not know the right questions to ask, and that's our responsibility to ask those questions, but they can report what a child can do. And the studies that have looked at child reports and professionals' reports of child functioning have shown that families are accurate reporters. I'm always interested in that fact that that's judged against the professionals' reports. Why aren't we judging the professionals' reports against the families' reports? Who has the most opportunity to help the child? And the people who have the opportunity to help the child are the people who are in the child's environment throughout the day and throughout the week. Remember the 7 circles? It's all the people who are there during the white time. And who is most interested in child progress? Clearly, the family is. So these are among many reasons why we need to make sure that our services are family-centered and not professional-centered. But let's also think about classrooms and clinics. Some children are served in classrooms, and there, by classrooms, I mean any kind of group care, like childcare, some people call it daycare, or preschool. The teacher is the caregiver, is one of the caregivers in those environments. And when we're serving the child and the teacher in those environments, the teacher sets the agenda, not us, not the visiting professionals. And the reason for our visits is to build the teacher's capacity. If, unfortunately, we are working in an unnatural environment like a clinic, the agenda is still the natural environments. In other words, the conversation that happens between the clinician and the family is still about the natural routines. We don't care what happens in the clinic. The clinic is not important. The clinic is not somewhere where the child needs to participate meaningfully. And the purpose of a clinic-based visit is still to build the caregiver's capacity. So I work in a number of countries where I have been unable to move services out of the clinic and into the natural environments, but we still work hard to make sure that the clinic-based visits are about the natural environments and are building the caregiver's capacity. So what is the purpose of early childhood intervention? It is to build the caregiver's capacity. And the question is why? And that is to maximize the amount and relevance of child intervention. When the caregivers have the knowledge and skills and motivation to intervene with their child, which is often just a variation of parenting in the case of parents, the child is then receiving much more intervention than they would be getting if intervention was focused on episodic hands-on from a professional. So how do we get there? First, we need to pay attention to needs assessment and then look at how we do intervention. And finally, look at our outcomes. So the needs assessment can be a routines-based interview, plus the things that go with that. A routines-based interview includes an Ecomap, which is a picture of the family's ecology. So we have the family, and we have their informal supports, their intermediate supports, and their formal supports. In early childhood intervention, we often fail to account for the family's informal supports. We often do know their formal supports because we have some place in our documentation where we list the services they get, for example. But social support research shows that the strength and extent of informal supports is a better predictor of the well-being of children and families than the strength and extent of formal supports. Informal supports are extended family, friends, neighbors. And we should, in our field, pay attention to find out who those people are, help families use them to the extent that they want to use them, and not just operate under the principle of got a need, get a service. Because when families can use their informal supports, that is using their assets. And this is known in the field as asset-based interventions. And it builds families' confidence when they can see that what they bring to the table in terms of their extended family, friends, and neighbors is a powerful support to the child. So that's what the Ecomap helps to determine. And also we use the Ecomaps then when we're helping to meet upcoming child and family needs. The routines-based interview is the crux of this needs assessment, and it is a detailed interview of the functioning of the child and family through the day. And during, in each routine of the day, that's defined by each individual family, because not all families operate the same way, we find out what the engagement, independence, and social relationships, remember those three things? What those are in each routine. And at the end of the interview, we then ask the family to decide what goals they want for their child and family. What's really interesting is that early in the interview, we ask the family what their main concerns are for their child. And they usually list 2 or 3 things. At the end of a routines-based interview, or RBI, we ask the family what they would like the team to help them with, what their goals are. And they come up with a whole list of things, much more extensive than the list that they initially started with. So the RBI is a way of generating goals that the family has for their child. These goals are not just based on delays or disabilities. They're based on what the family would like their child to be able to do in the future. So they truly are goals and not deficit-based. To do that, we then write participation-based goals and put that onto a matrix. So let me move ahead and show you some of these things. I talked about the Ecomap. It has informal supports, intermediate supports, and formal supports. And we have been very interested in Indigenous adaptations. Denise and I were recollecting recently an adaptation that was made in New Zealand, where the Maori decided they loved the Ecomap, but they wanted to make it vertical so that they could add in a bunch of people above the existing family. Who were those people? They were the ancestors, who are very much still part of families' lives in the Maori. And so that was a brilliant adaptation, which we were very happy to incorporate in New Zealand. In the RBI, I've already defined that, but I do want to mention the time, worry, and change questions. That's TWC there. The time question is, do you have enough time for yourself or yourself and another person? The worry question is, when you lie awake at night worrying, what do you worry about? And the change question is, if there's anything you could change in your life, what would it be? These questions are very natural towards the end of the RBI, and they produce very meaningful responses from families that are not directly tied to routines. And then they decide on goals. Let me give you an example of a participation-based goal. It's partly how it's written. So here is the goal statement. Dolores will participate in. So that's why it's called a participation-based goal. Every child goal begins with the child will participate in. And then it's the routines where the skill is needed. Breakfast, playtime, and dressing time by naming colors correctly. So the skill that the parents wanted Dolores to do was to name colors correctly. And this came up when they were talking about breakfast time, playtime, and dressing time. We then have criteria. In this case, we will know she can do this when she correctly names the color of 3 differently colored objects at breakfast, 1 playtime and dressing time in 1 day for 4 consecutive days. So the 3 differently colored objects is the acquisition criterion. Breakfast time, 1 playtime, and dressing time is the generalization criterion. And in 1 day for 4 consecutive days is the maintenance criterion. Here are some more examples. Rose will participate in the car ride home, circle time, and centers time by using 2-word combinations. We will know she uses 3 2-word combinations during each of these 3 times of day on 5 consecutive days. Another one. Sam will participate in going to school, going to the bathroom at school, and outside play. Those are the routines where the skill's needed. And the skill is by walking with his walker. The acquisition criterion is 10 yards at these times of the day, twice a day, on 3 of 5 days. That's the maintenance criterion. So the acquisition criteria can be frequency, how many times a child does something, very common in communication goals. Duration, for how long a child does something, that's very common in engagement. Distance, very common in ambulation, or other used to be known as walking goals, or moving. And volume, by that I mean amount, like for eating and drinking. Once we have goals, they get put onto a matrix. And the matrix has a short version of the goals down the left-hand side and the routines across the top. The routines might be home routines or they might be classroom routines. And X's go in the cells for which each of these goals was written. Some goals don't have any X's because those are the family goals, which are not necessarily tied to routines. I want to give you a few findings from some Australian research that's been done around these kinds of things. Hughes, Scholes et al., that's with Susanna Gavidia-Payne, found that families were concerned about their child's development and behavior. This is a study of the routines-based interview. They made accommodations to everyday routines for their child and reported priorities for the intervention. This team also found that in another study that overall, this study provided preliminary evidence that the implementation of what they called the routines-based early childhood intervention components improved children's participation in their daily routines at home and in the community. In a study that Kerry Bull and colleagues and I did, we found acceptable overall goal functionality, although measurement criteria are still a component that needs attention. Noteworthy changes in performance and satisfaction scores were found after the intervention, and the percentage of family goals moderated the influence of the context and meaningfulness of intervention goals on parents' perceptions of child difference in performance. So it's important to get to have family goals in our plans. So we're looking at the routines-based approach with all kinds of families. This is a picture of me working with a mother in rural Paraguay, and we're adapting this chair for this child who had severe cerebral palsy. This mother ended up being so happy because for the first time, she was able to look at her child rather than always have her child up on her shoulder. And the child was able to look around. By the way, this was their living room outside. So in routines-based visits, and we're winding down now, the family sets the agenda. We use collaborative, not expert consultation. And this has become a very big philosophical issue for us to promote equity. We have now come to understand that our old version of early childhood intervention has actually been promoting inequity, where we've been keeping families in their place instead of building their capacity. And we ask families when we are discussing an intervention about the plausibility and feasibility. These questions are, do you really think this will work? And with everything else you have going on at this time of the day, do you think you'll be able to do this? And if families say no to either one of those questions, we are so happy, because we are not left with the delusion that we came up with something that was going to work, when in fact the family's thinking, this is not going to work. And so having that honest response from families is refreshing. And the visit ends with a commitment by the family about what they're going to work on between now and the next visit. So when you think about the relevance of visits, think about functioning in regular routines. All the intervention occurs between visits. That's probably our most important mantra. And build the caregiver's capacity. That's the purpose of the visits. So please do stay in touch by writing to eieio@ua.edu or visiting our website at www.eieio.ua.edu.